Welcome to the deep dive. Ever wondered what really makes the difference between just a good ultrasound image and one that truly nails the diagnosis?
Yeah, what takes it from okay to great?
Exactly. So today, we're kind of pulling back the curtain on the physics behind it all, the stuff that powers those amazing images. We've been digging through some listener study notes, specifically day 5 of ultrasound physics study. Pretty detailed stuff.
It is.
And we're going to unpack Doppler, the magic of transducers, and imaging resolution.
And the goal really is to make these concepts stick, make them useful for you.
Right. Not just theory, but practical understanding.
Precisely. This deep dive, it's really designed to give you a much deeper feel for how these images are actually made and interpreted.
Which is key.
Absolutely. We'll focus on the core ideas that, directly shape image quality and ultimately how accurate your diagnosis can be.
So understanding this foundation is pretty vital if you want to be truly well-informed.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Essential stuff.
Okay, let's unpack this then. First up, Doppler ultrasound. Let's revisit that, specifically pulsed wave Doppler.
Okay.
Now, if you've worked with ultrasound, you've definitely seen this, maybe wrestled with it. Aliasing.
Oh, yeah, the bane of many scans.
It feels like the machine's messing with you sometimes. So what exactly is aliasing? Why does it happen? Is it just a glitch?
It's more fundamental than a glitch, actually. It's a limitation inherent in sampling, especially with pulsed waves. The weird thing, the really counterintuitive part about aliasing is how it makes high speeds look, wrong. They might even look like they're going backward on the display.
Like watching car wheels spin backward in a movie.
Exactly that kind of effect. It happens when the Doppler shift, the change in frequency we're measuring, goes above a specific limit.
Okay, a limit.
Yeah, it's called the Nyquist frequency. Think of it as the system's speed limit for detecting frequency shifts accurately.
And what determines that limit?
It's directly tied to how often we're sending out pulses. The Nyquist frequency is exactly half of the pulse repetition frequency, the PRF.
Got it. So the PRF is our sampling rate, how often we listen.
Precisely. And if the real Doppler shift is higher than half that sampling rate, the system just can't keep up. It gets confused, and you get aliasing.
So if you don't sample fast enough, you miss crucial info, and the picture gets distorted. That's a big deal clinically.
Huge deal. You need to recognize it.
Right. Now, pulse wave is great for pinpointing flow at one spot. But sometimes you need the bigger picture, right? Like flow across a whole vessel.
That's where color flow Doppler comes in.
How does that work? How does it build on this? And, what's its main advantage?
Well, color flow Doppler is super important for exactly that, visualizing the overall blood flow patterns. You see it used everywhere.
Right.
It uses the same basic Doppler principles, but instead of just the spectral graph for one point, it processes the Doppler shifts across a whole area and displays them as a color map. Usually red for flow towards the transducer, blue for away.
So it gives you that immediate visual sense of direction and speed, broadly speaking.
Exactly. And getting that nice, clear color image relies heavily on some pretty sophisticated signal processing behind the scenes. That processing is key across all Doppler tech, really, turning raw echoes into something meaningful.
And when we look at the detailed information, like from pulse wave, we talk about the Doppler spectrum. So what's the significance of that spectrum, and why is its timing so important?
The spectrum. It's packed with information. It doesn't just give you an average speed. It shows the whole range of velocities present in the sample volume at any given moment.
So you can see if the flow is smooth or turbulent, things like that.
Precisely. And the timing is critical because blood flow changes dramatically throughout the heartbeat. The spectrum shows you those changes, tied directly to systole and diastole, the phases of the cardiac cycle. Understanding that timing lets you figure out if the flow pattern is normal or if something's wrong. It's crucial for interpretation.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears. This is where it gets really interesting for me. Transducers and imaging.
The business end.
Yeah. These are the gadgets actually making the pictures. So how does a transducer produce the ultrasound? And is there a big difference between how pulse systems and continuous wave systems do it?
Oh, definitely distinct differences. At the heart of it, you've got these special piezoelectric crystals. Zap them with electricity, they vibrate, they make sound waves.
Okay, piezoelectric effect.
Right. Now, in pulsed ultrasound, the frequency of the sound, like how high-pitched it is, that's determined by the crystal itself. Specifically, its thickness and the material's propagation speed. It's kind of baked into the crystal.
So the crystal dictates the frequency in pulsed mode.
Mostly, yes. But for continuous wave ultrasound, it's different. The frequency isn't set by the crystal's properties in the same way. Instead, it's determined by the electrical frequency the machine sends to the crystal.
Ah, so the machine drives the frequency directly.
Exactly. So if the machine sends a 6 millihertz electrical signal to a continuous wave transducer, guess what? You get a 6 millihertz acoustic wave coming out.
That's a really clear difference and important for different uses, I imagine.
Absolutely.
This brings up something I hear asked a lot. If you increase the PRF, the pulse repetition frequency, does that change the ultrasound frequency?
Common misconception. No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
Nope. Increasing the PRF just means you're sending pulses out more often. The frequency of the waves within each pulse stays exactly the same.
Okay, so PRF is how often, frequency is what pitch. Separate thing.
You got it. They're independent. Now, what does influence the frequency, besides the thickness we mentioned for pulsed wave, is also the diameter of the active element.
The size of the crystal face.
Sort of, yeah. And here's another slightly counterintuitive thing. If you have two pulsed wave crystals made of the same material, the thicker one will actually produce a lower frequency ultrasound pulse.
Thicker makes lower.
Yeah.
That feels backward.
It does, but think of it like guitar strings. Thicker strings vibrate slower, producing lower notes. It's about the resonant frequency determined by the physical dimension.
Okay, that helps. So we have the transducer making the sound, but then there are those accessories like the matching layer and the gel.
Absolutely vital accessory.
Why are they so critical? Why can't we just, put the transducer on the skin?
Air. Air is the enemy of ultrasound transmission into the body. There's a huge difference in acoustic impedance, basically, how resistant the material is to sound waves between the transducer element in air and then air in skin.
So the sound would just bounce back.
Massively. Most of it would reflect right off the skin. The matching layer is a thin layer on the transducer face designed to have an impedance between the crystal and the skin. It acts like a stepping stone, reducing that big jump.
Letting more sound through.
Exactly. And the acoustic gel. Its job is to get rid of any tiny air pockets between the matching layer and the skin. It ensures good contact and efficient transmission of that sound energy into the body.
So no gel, bad image.
Pretty much. You need both for efficient transmission.
Okay, let's talk about the sound beam itself. You mentioned it's like a flashlight beam, not perfectly straight. What do we need to know about how beams behave, especially in continuous mode?
Right. The beam shape is important. Every transducer creates a beam with a near zone, sometimes called the Fresnel zone, right in front of it. That's where the beam is most focused, most intense.
The useful part, mostly.
Generally, yeah. Now, in continuous mode, something interesting happens. At the very end of that near zone, the beam actually narrows down. Its diameter becomes half the diameter of the transducer face.
It gets tighter.
Right at that specific point, yes, the tightest focus. But then as it goes further out into the far zone or Fraunhofer zone, it starts to diverge, spread out.
Like the flashlight beam spreading.
Exactly. And if you go out to a distance equal to twice the near zone length, the beam diameter actually expands back out to be equal to the original transducer diameter.
Wow, okay, so it focuses, then spreads back out?
Yep. Understanding that shape helps you know where your best resolution will be. Also, remember, diffraction, the natural tendency of waves to spread out. This is especially significant when the sound source, or parts of it, are small, close to the size of the wavelength itself.
And getting those really sharp, precise images we see, especially deep inside the body. How do we control that beam so well?
That comes down to electronic focusing. It's a really clever technique, especially in modern phased array transducers.
Phased arrays are the ones with lots of little elements.
Exactly. Instead of one big crystal, you have many small ones. By applying tiny, precisely timed delays to the electrical pulses sent to each of those individual elements, you can electronically steer and focus the ultrasound beam.
So you're shaping the beam electronically, not physically moving anything.
Correct. It gives incredible control over the beam shape and focal point, letting us optimize the image for different depths and situations. It's fundamental to getting high-quality images.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into resolution. You hear that word all the time. It sounds simple, but it's key to image quality. Right.
Absolutely fundamental.
So what does resolution really mean in ultrasound? Why is it the make or break factor for diagnosis?
Resolution, in its simplest terms, is just the ability to tell two things apart. Two structures that are close together, can you see them as two distinct objects, or do they just blur into one blob?
If you can't tell them apart, you might miss something important.
Exactly. Now, there are different types of resolution. Let's start with longitudinal resolution.
Okay.
This is about distinguishing two structures that are lined up, one behind the other, front to back, along the direction the sound beam is traveling.
Along the beam path.
Right. It has a bunch of other names, too. Axial, range, radial, depth resolution. They all mean the same thing. And it's measured in distance, like millimeters. How close can 2 points be front to back and still look separate?
What determines how good that is?
Two main things. The wavelength of the ultrasound is a big one. Shorter wavelengths generally give better resolution. And the other factor is something called the Q factor.
Q factor, what's that?
The Q factor relates to the purity, or maybe better, the length of the ultrasound pulse. A high Q factor means the crystal rings for a long time after it's pulsed, creating a long pulse. A low Q factor means it's heavily damped, it rings very briefly, creating a short, sharp pulse.
Like a quick ping versus a long boing.
Perfect analogy, and here's the key. For better longitudinal resolution, better ability to separate things front to back, you actually want a lower Q factor.
Lower Q is better.
Yes, because a shorter pulse means you can distinguish objects that are closer together along the beam. So, somewhat counterintuitively, decreasing the Q factor improves longitudinal resolution, which improves the picture quality.
Got it. Shorter ping, better front-to-back detail. Okay, what about things side by side?
Ah, that's lateral resolution.
Lateral.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Also known as angular or azimuthal resolution. There's a little acronym people use. Lateral, lateral, angular, transverse, azimuthal. Helps remember them.
Lateral. Okay.
Lateral resolution is the minimum distance side to side, perpendicular to the beam, that two structures can be separated by and still be seen as two distinct echoes.
So how close can they be next to each other?
Essentially, yes.
No.
And what's interesting here, similar to longitudinal, is that as the numerical value of the lateral resolution gets smaller, meaning the system can distinguish things that are closer together side by side, the better the image looks visually.
Smaller number, sharper side-to-side picture. What influences lateral resolution? Is it the Q factor again?
Not directly like longitudinal. Lateral resolution is primarily determined by the beam width. A narrower beam can distinguish objects that are closer together side by side.
Ah, so it connects back to beam focusing.
Exactly. That electronic focusing we talked about, it's crucial for improving lateral resolution, especially at depth.
Okay, this is all great detail, but let's bring it back to the clinic. What does all this resolution talk mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about axial versus lateral, Q factors, beam widths? How does knowing this help day to day?
Because understanding these different types of resolution is absolutely fundamental to interpreting what you see on the screen. You need to know the system's limitations.
Like knowing where the image might be blurrier.
Precisely. The resolution capability directly impacts your diagnostic accuracy. Can you actually see that tiny lesion? Can you tell it apart from the tissue next to it? If the resolution isn't good enough in that area, you might miss it entirely or misinterpret it.
That's huge.
It is. And you also need to realize there are often trade-offs. Sometimes optimizing for one type of resolution might slightly compromise another. Techniques to improve lateral resolution, like focusing, are super important for overall image quality, giving us those clearer diagnostic pictures. But knowing why it's clearer or where it might be less clear, that comes from understanding this physics.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive covered some really core stuff. We hit Doppler, getting into the weeds on aliasing and that crucial Nyquist frequency.
The speed limit.
Then we moved to transducers.
Yeah.
How those piezoelectric crystals work, the difference between pulsed and continuous wave frequency generation, and why things like matching layers and gel are non-negotiable.
Can't skip the gel.
Definitely not. And finally, we really unpacked resolution, telling apart longitudinal or axial from lateral resolution, understanding how factors like wavelength, Q factor, and beam width shape what we see.
And how that directly links to making an accurate diagnosis.
Exactly. It all comes back to that.
It really does. Understanding the why behind the image, the physics, is just so critical for using ultrasound effectively in the clinic. It helps you choose the right transducer for the job, optimize your settings.
Which leads to better images.
Better images, more confident interpretations. And remember, this field doesn't stand still. Ultrasound physics and technology are constantly evolving, so staying curious, continuing to learn, it's essential.
For sure.
So keep applying these concepts. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As transducer technology keeps getting better with new materials, better focusing, how might these continuous advancements revolutionize what we can see? How much more detail might become visible in the near future?